What's up, guys? It's Paul from Boosted Films, and in this video we're going to take a look at removing the front spindles and front wheel bearings on my rusty silver EVO. So first I'm going to go through some of the basic components, show you where things are and what you'll be taking apart. Then I will quickly go over some tools that you may not have, some lesser common tools that you may not have that you do need to complete this job. And then of course I'm going to walk through step by step, showing you how I removed the front wheel bearings and front spindles from my EVO. First things first, we're looking at the passenger side spindle of my EVO, and basically towards the rear of the car, towards the middle of it, is where it connects to the outer tie rod end. That's part of your steering. And this also currently has our ABS sensor still attached to it. That's honestly one of the worst parts about this. Those ABS sensors just get stuck and seized in there, so they're usually tough to get out. And then the top of the spindle connects to your strut, and the bottom of the spindle connects to your lower ball joint. Now, some tools you may not have in your garage if you don't have a whole lot that you will need for this job. Number one, a breaker bar. Number two, 1.25 inch or 32 millimeter socket. You need a big socket to get those nuts off the axles, off the CV shafts. And then finally, a pry bar. You'll probably need some sort of pry bar to get those lower ball joints off. Otherwise, most of the nuts and bolts you're going to be dealing with today are going to be 19 millimeter or 17 millimeter. So the first thing you're going to have to do is get your car up on jack stands and then remove your wheel or wheels, depending on what you're doing. So of course I just removed the driver's side wheel here of my EVO. Next thing I did is I just removed that cotter pin that holds that nut on, that larger nut that holds the CV shaft in place. And then of course, because this is the rustiest EVO you'll ever see, I had to spray all the nuts with some PB Blaster. I recommend you do the same. It wouldn't hurt if you have some PB Blaster around or something to spray those nuts a little bit, nuts and bolts, all of them that you're going to touch. Even if you can spray them maybe a day or two in advance, that might help as well. Otherwise, you just might end up needing heat, which, yeah, we'll be needing heat for this later as well. So after I spray everything, the first thing I'm going to do is remove my brake caliper. So there are two bolts holding your brake caliper in place. These are two 19 millimeters, I believe. So you may need a breaker bar for these. An impact might work as well if you have an impact available. But break these loose and then remove them all the way. And once that brake caliper is loose, you should be able to lift it up off the rotor and get it out of the way. And to keep it out of the way for this, since we don't want to disconnect that brake line, we're just going to get a piece of wire or something. You could even use an old coat hanger, something like that. Just wire that up to your strut or the spring on your strut for the time being. Next, we're going to remove our brake rotor. Of course, mine's pretty rusty and stuck, so I'm just taking a big hammer to mine to remove it. But pro tip, if you're trying to save your brake rotors and it seems like they're stuck on, you'll notice that there's two holes that kind of go around where the bolt pattern is. Those two little holes there, you should be able to actually put a bolt in. You can run a bolt through there and then thread it in. The threads won't even really matter too much, honestly, because you're just running a bolt in. If you run just a random bolt that you have around that you're not worried about, you thread a bolt in and then use a ratchet or a socket to tighten it up, and then that will press against the actual hub, and that would remove or slowly loosen your brake rotor if you didn't want to use a hammer on it. And of course, because this is the rustiest EVO you'll ever see, this one had the brake dust shield was already broken off, but there is one bolt, I believe just one, holding that brake dust shield in place. So you'd have to remove a bolt to remove that brake dust shield as well. And now that I have easier access to view the 4 bolts that hold the wheel bearing in place, I'm going to spray those 4 bolts with a little PB Blaster as well. Next, I move on to my strut tower bolts, and I try to use my impact, but they are not budging. So this is where heat comes in for me. I've talked about this in some of my other videos, but I have a magnetic heat induction gun, and this thing is an awesome alternative to a torch. So if you need heat, I highly recommend it, especially in a circumstance like this where you can actually get right onto the nut of something. This is where it works fabulous. So what I'm going to do is heat up these nuts and then remove them with my impact here. And be careful with this when you're working around this strut. You want to make sure you're removing the nut and not the bolt side, and especially with the top one, because the top one is not made to spin in place. So you do not want to put an impact on that top bolt head and try to spin that one out. You definitely want to make sure you're trying to get the nut of that top strut bolt. And of course they may be spinning in place. You may have to put a wrench on the other side like I did to remove this lower bolt and nut. Good news for you guys is, honestly, if nothing should go as bad as this one does if your EVO is not as rusty as mine. So hey, the next thing we're going to do is move on to the outer tie rod end. Of course, that's part of the steering rack. And we're going to loosen up the bolt that holds that in place. That is also a 19 millimeter nut, excuse me, not a bolt. So luckily I'm able to just spin that off with my impact, and that worked here for me. And one thing to release it, you do kind of need a big hammer, and if you have a big hammer and you just hit on the spindle arm, kind of right where that goes through, it will eventually pop free, as mine did here. So that's kind of the key to that. You don't really want to hit right on that tie rod end. You'd rather hit on that spindle arm to get that to break loose. And then if it's spinning in place, like I'm showing here, when you're using the impact, you can see that it's just spinning and the nut's not coming off. A trick for that is usually just to tighten it back up and then release it quickly, and then it should come off all the way. Worst case scenario, you could potentially put a vice grip on that lower part where that rubber boot is to hold it from spinning as well. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove this lower ball joint here. And again, this is where a breaker bar comes in handy. And this ball joint nut is actually a 17 millimeter nut, where most of the other stuff we were doing was a 19 millimeter. So I'm going to break that free with my breaker bar, and impact may work as well. And then once I take the nut off all the way, there is basically the ability to kind of hit that bolt with a hammer a bit to slide it out. So I use the hammer to knock that bolt out part way. And then it's still kind of stuck in there, so my trick for that was to use a little pry bar to put a little leverage on it, and then use an impact to spin it, reverse it out while you're putting a little leverage on it, and then it should be able to slide out. Next, we're going to come to what I said was kind of a specialty item tool here. You need a big socket to get that nut off. So now I'm going to remove the nut that holds the CV shaft in place, that half shaft, if you will. And I was able to just spin mine off with the impact wrench. If you do not have an impact wrench, if you have a friend around that can just step on the brake pedal for you, you would have had to have broken it loose while the brakes were still on the car, but you could do that as well. Have someone hold the brake pedal while you use a breaker bar to break that nut loose. The other alternative I've seen is if you still have your brakes on, again, if you don't have an impact, if you have your brakes on the car, you could put a screwdriver into the fins of the brake rotor, and then where the brake rotor catches the brake caliper, that would kind of hold it in place as well, because that screwdriver would stop it from spinning. So that's also an alternative if you're by yourself and don't have a friend and don't have an impact. So if you're not removing your spindle and you're just looking at doing this to change your wheel bearing, you will still want to, loosen this CV shaft. Basically, the main reason is what I'm showing here is once that CV shaft is free, it's a lot easier to get a socket onto those 4 bolts that hold that wheel bearing in place. And also the trick I found basically is if your wheel bearings are really tough to get off, you're probably just going to want to remove that CV shaft anyway, because the easiest way to end up pounding out that wheel bearing will just be to hit it directly with a clean shot from the back. And the only way you can do that is if you removed your CV shaft. And the good news is you don't have to pop your CV shaft out of your transmission. You can just pop it out of that wheel bearing, and then you should be able to have easier access to knocking out that wheel bearing. So next step here is I'm using my pry bar to pry down on that lower control arm so I can remove that lower ball joint. And what I actually ended up doing a couple times here is removing stuff and then adding it again. I took out the lower ball joint here, again, just so I could get that CV shaft out of the way completely and get it out of that wheel bearing. And then to make it easier to work on some items later, I ended up putting that lower ball joint back in place on the spindle. So of course, now that that CV shaft is out of the way, I'm able to get my impact in and remove the 4 bolts holding the wheel bearing to the spindle. And as I briefly touched on, now I'm going to put things back together a little bit because that's going to make it easier to try to hammer out that wheel bearing. So I'm going to pop that outer tie rod back in place, put that nut on to hold it in, and basically all 3 points that hold that spindle in place are now reconnected or just still slightly connected to kind of hold everything in place. And the next thing I'm going to do is take a hammer and make sure I'm hammering basically the wheel bearing to hit that wheel bearing and get it out of place. These can be very, very tough to get out if you don't kind of know this trick to actually remove that CV shaft and get at it from the back. If you're just trying to hit where the wheel mounts, you might end up just separating the wheel bearing itself, and then you're trying to get a pry bar, or a screwdriver in, to knock that wheel bearing out. And I think it's honestly just easier to just kind of hit it from the backside. Of course, I didn't plan on reusing these wheel bearings, so I wasn't worried about it. But if you're reusing your wheel bearing for some reason and taking it out, which I don't know why you would, I guess you'd want to try to be more gentle with it. And now really I'm just documenting a bit about how that ABS sensor looks like. I was not able to get mine out. I feel like they've been in this car for almost 20 years and they were just stuck in there. So I had to destroy both mine to get these spindles fully out. So hopefully you do not have to touch yours. But if you do, you can see this ABS sensor wire runs up towards the shock, and then just underneath your fender there is a plug-in up there. Yeah, I know it's rusty. Feel free to comment that my car is very rusty. It helps the algorithm when you comment. So what I did on this one before I removed the spindle is just popped out that line. I did find some new sensors, not OEM of course, but some new sensors for I believe only like $20-30 each. So that doesn't make me feel as bad about destroying these ones when I removed them, but we'll see how that goes. I'll probably update. I might do a video just on the ABS sensors later. So once that is free and out of the way, otherwise I believe it's a 12mm bolt holding that ABS sensor in. So if you had a lot of good luck and you could remove that 12mm bolt and then just pull out your sensor, well, more power to you for being able to do that. So the next thing we're going to do is just remove all those connections that we had loosely in place. So I'm going to pop out that lower ball joint once again, and then I'm going to remove the outer tie rod, and then finally all I need to do is remove the strut bolts. And that's it. There is your spindle. Your spindle is now off. Now I know just removing things is only half the battle, so hopefully I'll do an install video about this stuff as well, but I find it's easier for me to do this kind of video right after I've kind of done the job, so I'm trying to get this one out as soon as I can. So that's about it for this video, guys. As always, I appreciate you watching, and of course, if there are updates, if I did anything wrong, I'm sure the internet will let me know with the comment section. So yeah, leave a comment, tell me what I did wrong, tell me what you would do differently, tell me how rusty this EVO is and how much you wish it was yours. For me, it's a low cost investment, so I can just spend some time doing all these types of things. So also let me know what you kind of want to see. What do you want to learn about to do on your EVO? I might be able to tackle it in the near future. So again, any comments are appreciated in the comment section. Any updates that may have need to be made with this video, I can't update the video super easily, so updates might be in the video description as well. Watch for that, or look for a pinned comment from me if I did something totally wrong. And shameless plug, I have plenty of more videos on my website, boostedfilms.com. If you're working on your EVO and need to know how to do something, there's probably a video out there for you that can help. So visit my website, boostedfilms.com. Feel free to follow me on social media as well. Send me a message if you'd like. And as always, this is Paul from Boosted Films saying thanks so much for watching.